beliefs and many gods.
Hinduism, the word makes it sound as if it's a single tradition, but in fact it's this incredibly complex mix of many different cultures.
We have an absolute dazzling diversity of forms of God, holy texts, forms of worship.
In this film, we explore the fascinating history of 5 very different temples across Britain, from their humble beginnings to architectural masterpieces. And through the stories of the people who worship here, we'll reveal the turbulent and complicated tale of Hinduism in Britain. It's a story of rebellion and protest.
They don't close churches down or anything like that, so why are they closing our manor down?
You've got to understand, Hindus don't do this. But they just felt this was their chance to make a statement.
A tale of loss and exile.
One of the army personnel comes to me and says, "Your name is on a hit list. Please leave to save your life."
Beauty and hope.
The temple is something which is my soul.
One of the earliest Hindus to settle in Britain was 81-year-old Krishan Mittal. Arriving here more than 50 years ago, he became an unassuming pioneer of one of the first places to be used as a Hindu temple. No work of art, but a shop in Bradford. Mr. Mittal's journey to the UK began in India, at a time when the country was in turmoil.
In 1947, India gained its independence from the British. But it was at a great cost, because India was divided between 2 countries, India and Pakistan.
Like many Hindus, Mr. Mittal and his family found themselves living in mainly Muslim Pakistan. Religious tensions ran high, and they were forced to flee.
There was madness. Nobody knew what they are doing. That's it. It was madness. Trains were just like cargo. People used to walk on foot, miles, loaded with their leftover things on shoulders and children like this in there. It was, I can't find word. Inhuman.
Krishan moved to Delhi in India, where he began working as a teacher. It was here that he heard from a friend about new opportunities.
In my school, there was a teacher, Mr. Narang. He said most of the people from Punjab are going to England. Why don't you try your luck?
The first substantial migration of Hindus really got underway in the 1950s. After the Second World War, Britain needed manpower because there was a shortage of people to work in factories and foundries.
Mr. Mittal made for Bradford, where he found a job at a textile mill. And once he'd established himself, he turned to finding a place of worship. For him and his Hindu friends, it was the Muslim and Sikh Asians who spurred them into action.
Muslims started building up their own mosques, and Sikhs started making gurdwaras. But the Hindus didn't have anything.
With a lack of funds, they had to improvise by transforming their own homes into makeshift temples.
Then we started worshipping at our own houses every Sunday, and gradually the other Hindus who were living around, they started joining us.
Anywhere can be made a sacred space in Hinduism. You invite God to come into it and say, this is a pure place now, please come here and be with us. And everyone comes together as a congregation for this. And then after the ceremony, you can envelope it and it becomes a house again.
Mr. Mittal's home in Bradford, a former shop, became one of the regular places the Punjabi Hindus gathered for prayers.
This is 409 Airwood Street, and we used to come and worship in this house so many times. Worship where this is, they have got this display area, and we used to live upstairs, and this room used to be empty. So naturally there was quite enough space for people to come and stay in and worship. And then we used to have sanctified food.
For early arrivals from India, often men on their own without their families, worshipping together in their own homes was more than just religious ritual. It was a way of keeping their Hindu identity alive in a culture where there were few links with the land they'd left behind.
That was just to keep in touch with our religion and with our culture, because we don't want to forget.
But temples aren't just about maintaining identity. At the end of the 60s, they became a place of refuge for a new surge of Hindu arrivals to Britain, not drawn by work, but fleeing expulsion from Africa. Today marks a historic moment for the worshippers at one of Leicester's oldest temples. It's an event that only takes place once in a generation.
Today's really an important day where we will be bringing two new goddesses into our mandir, into our temple. Mother Ganga, who is the river Ganges all the way from India. Also Goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of knowledge.
Vibhuti Acharya is one of the first female presidents of a Hindu temple in the UK.
They're brought in with high reverence because they're believed to be not just statues, but living gods who will be blessing us in the mandir for many, many years to come.
The arrival of the goddesses marks the anniversary of when the first deities were installed here 40 years ago. At the same time as Vibhuti and her family, including her two sisters, Bhati and Hema, arrived in Leicester from Tanzania.
We came here very early in 1972. My father was feeling that the face of Africa was changing, and he felt slightly unsettled. He had the 3 daughters, and he felt that perhaps the prospects were better in the UK.
In fact, behind the temple's celebrations lie stories of persecution and exile. Most of the Asians who come here are from East Africa, descendants of families sent there by the British from colonial India.
At the end of the 19th century, the British, who were administering East Africa, decided to lay a railway. That actually meant that they need people with skills in ironwork, in woodwork, and so forth.
With such skills in short supply in Africa, the British brought Indians from Gujarat on the west coast of India to work on the railway, which stretched from Kenya to Uganda. But once it was finished, many Asians chose not to return, instead setting up businesses, often becoming affluent. But in the early 1960s, they found their lives thrown into turmoil when all over Africa, former British colonies were gaining independence.
This was a time when the East African states were seeking greater Africanization. So the prosperous Hindu community felt increasingly insecure.
In one country in particular, the treatment of the Asians was unexpectedly violent. In the 1970s, Maz Mashru was working in Uganda as a photojournalist when President Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of Asian minorities from the country.
I announced the decision to ask the British government to take over responsibility for the British citizens of Asian origin.
There was an announcement from President Idi Amin that we had 90 days to leave the country.
It was a moment that changed the course of Maz's life.
Because I was involved with the previous regime, they had put 4 times a gun on my chest. And my informant comes to me and said that please leave to save your life.
In order to escape Amin's threats, Maz and his wife had to make the dangerous journey to the British Passport Office in the country's capital.
When I was going to Kampala, there were 19 roadblocks manned by the army people. On each roadblock, we had to stop, identify ourselves, exhibit all our belongings, and if they thought that there was something valuable, they would just help themselves and that belonged to them. Like they removed earrings out of my wife's ears. They pulled the chain out of my wife's neck. They also got the wedding ring, but I managed to convince them that that was a wedding ring, and they gave that back. And it was very painful experience.
Maz managed to make it to Britain and settled in Leicester. He assumed he'd found safety. But there was a shock on arrival. Far from being a haven, it was a place of hostility.
They're coming from another country. We're paying so much a week, national health and stuff, and they come in and get it straight away for nothing.
It's about time the government took over its responsibilities and sent these people back to their country of origin.
Sadly, when we came to this country, a lot of people thought we are coming from a dark continent, we were illiterate, and we came here to exploit the wealth of this country.
It must have been devastating for them. They lost their homes, they lost their way of life. What they took with them was their Hindu tradition.
For a community left with so little, finding the resources for a place to worship was tough. So rather than custom build a temple, he adapted an existing building. A disused Baptist church was transformed into the Sri Sanatan Mandir. And in a strange and sometimes hostile world, it was the temple that provided a place of familiarity and security. For the Acharya sisters arriving from Tanzania as children, it was a second home.
The whole of the temple was like a huge playground for us. A massive playground where we'd play hide and seek, and the priest used to play with us and join in.
And he was aged, the poor man, but he would be like, okay,
I'm going to find you, I'm going to find you. And he used to say, I'm coming, and we used to hide, crouch right down on the floor.
Yeah. And he was so nice.
Under the bench, because at that time you could get under the bench and you could not be seen. And also, on top of the temple, we used to be able to leap onto the dome and hide behind the dome.
For a people who've lost everything and survived, the temple is more than just a place of gods and rituals. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
This mandir to me is a place of survival.
We have a lovely word called pran, and it means spirit or breath. And the mandir is really like our every breath. It shows our struggle, it shows our achievement. It It reflects our love and unity.
The temple is something which is my soul.
The spread of Hinduism in Britain hasn't always been driven by migration. It was a temple bought by a British music legend that would change the face of Hinduism and unite the community in a fight for religious freedom. In 1971, George Harrison became the first member of the Beatles to have a solo #1. My Sweet Lord became the biggest-selling record of the year, and it reflected Harrison's newfound passion for a religious movement inspired by a Hindu holy man. In 1965, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada took the West by storm. At the age of 69, he gave up his family and responsibilities in India and went to America, where he began to attract followers to a movement which spread worldwide. His message was simple.
Prabhupada's main focus was chanting the name of Krishna. And when you chant the names of Krishna, it's as if the god was dancing on your tongue. So it's the idea that in every part of your body you're making divine service.
It was a meeting between Prabhupada and George Harrison that led to the founding of a temple in leafy Hertfordshire that would become the focus of one of the most passionate disputes in the history of Hinduism in Britain.
We called George and said, we found this beautiful manor building in Lichmore Heath. He said, go ahead. He purchased it and we opened Bhaktivedanta Manor in the summer of 1973. George's lawyers applied for the planning just to make sure that was okay. They wrote to the local council and said, we're going to use it as a residential training centre for Krishna consciousness.
It was a decision that would thrust this little-known English manor into the spotlight, as very quickly it became clear that this wasn't just a quiet place of learning, popular with converts. It was also attracting the wider Hindu community.
It wasn't just the people who were following the movement who came here. There were a lot of Hindus who were coming here as well, because this was the one large temple that we could all come out and visit, especially at Janmashtami, which is the birth date of Krishna. And that's the day when all Hindus actually make a point of coming to the temple. So we'd have a large numbers of cars coming through the village, which then really made an issue for the villagers. They were saying that they can't get into the village, there's a lot of noise, and they felt that the quiet village atmosphere was being taken away.
Complaints about visitor numbers were made to the council. The controversy focused on the manor's purpose and whether a building, established as a theological college, could also serve as a place of public worship.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a meeting of the Bushy and Alderman Planning Sub-Board.
I think the council felt that a residential training place would be like a monastery, so there wouldn't be very many people coming to it. Whereas what they were seeing at the manor was tens of thousands of people coming on big occasions.
Despite the Hare Krishna's suggestion of building an alternative access road bypassing the village, in 1994 matters came to a head. The local council issued an order which, if enforced, would close the manor for public worship and turn all Hindu visitors into lawbreakers.
When we heard that the manor would be closed, the Hindu, everyone was really upset.
The temple was to close on March the 16th. I remember standing in the temple the night before. It was packed. It was a Tuesday night. Everyone was in there and they thought, this could be our last chance to visit the temple.
For British Hindus, who usually kept a low profile, It was a threat that galvanized them into action.
Thousands of Hindus from all over the country converged on central London today to protest at what they say is an attack on their freedom to worship.
They don't close churches down or anything like that, so why are they closing our man down?
We want to worship and we want to know our rights, what to do with the God.
It was such a great feeling to see that so many people have taken time off, closed their businesses, and come there to help us to keep this place open.
We'd no idea how many people were going to come for that. As it turned out, the police told me on that day it was 37,000 people.
No one believes that any other community would suffer like this. The government and the local council would never try to close down any other shrine or religious institute in the way that they have treated this temple. It's insane.
And you've got to understand, Hindus don't do this. They are law-abiding, they're so careful, but they just felt this was their chance to make a statement.
It was an outpouring of support that paid off. A year later, the Secretary of State agreed that if a new access road was created, the manor could remain open.
It was a sign, really, that Hindus had arrived.
It was such a joy and relief. And they were so pleased with themselves, actually, so proud that they had risked everything and it actually had paid off.
As the Hare Krishnas celebrated their victory, a long-established temple was making the difference between life and death for Hindus fleeing civil war. Towering above the suburbs of northeast London is a temple that's home to one of the least understood Hindu communities in Britain, the Tamils. Originating from South India and the island of Sri Lanka, the Tamil Hindus have their own language and religious traditions. And today, devotees are gathering to celebrate a festival focusing on their patron deity, Murugan.
Murugan is well known as a warrior god. He's considered to be the son of Lord Shiva, who is the main god in the Hindu pantheon. He's also the brother of the elephant-headed god Ganesh, and he's known for a rather strong, almost fighting aspect, and he carries a spear called a vel in Tamil.
The London Sri Murugan Temple was established as a place of worship by South Indian Hindus in the mid-70s. But a decade later, it became home to refugees seeking sanctuary from a 30-year civil war in Sri Lanka, a war that claimed the lives of more than 100,000. The conflict began in 1983.
There have been reports of more violence in Sri Lanka,
when predominantly Hindu Tamils were attacked by members of the mainly Buddhist Sinhalese majority in pogroms in the capital, Colombo. An event that became known as Black July. Jana was living in the north of the island when the violence began.
Many Tamils was robbed or killed and many people injured. Their homes burnt.
Acts of horrific violence were committed against the Tamil population. Tamil people were executed in the street. People were beaten to death by mobs. People were burnt alive.
It was an event that plunged the country into civil war. Militant youth movements, including the infamous Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, began fighting the Sinhalese nationalist government to establish an independent Tamil state. But the Tamil Tigers were just one of many armed factions vying for new recruits. It was a dangerous rivalry that the teenage Jana got caught up in, with terrifying consequences.
I was abducted by one of the militant group, blindfolded and took it by the van. I was kept under armed guard, possibly to execute. I know many people killed, so similarly I faced, yes, my life is going to end.
Jana was lucky. He was rescued by friends, but he realised his only chance of a future without violence was to flee his homeland.
If I want to stay there, I have to kill few people, or I need to leave the country. So I leave the country, because my struggle is not fighting against the people.
Coming to Britain saved Jana's life. And for Tamil refugees like him, the Hindu temple had a fundamental role to play.
Temples are not just places of worship. They're not even just places of community gathering. They can be places that make the difference between life and death. This was the case with many of the young men who fled the civil war. They were often able to take refuge in these temples. They were fed there. They slept there. They became the center of their existence while they recreated their lives in Britain.
For Tamil people, temples are more than the place of worship. Because once they saw the temple, then they got the strong belief they can achieve whatever they want. They can solve whatever their problem. All can be achieved through the temple.
Over the past 60 years, the face of British Hinduism has changed beyond recognition. The community is no longer improvising worship in back-to-backs, but crafting breathtaking structures in the heart of British cities. And it's northwest London that's the home to the largest Hindu temple in Europe. It's a reflection of just how far Hinduism has come.
The Eastern Temple represents one of the most confident statements of religious and cultural identity, not just in the scale and the detail with which it was built, but also the way in which it was presented as part of a multicultural Britain. It shows that Hinduism is as much a part of the British landscape as our churches.
Hindu temples are far more than religious buildings. They're monuments of hope. An enduring testament to a community that has suffered loss and persecution